dinner for those of you elsewhere. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Welcome back, everybody. This is the second session of our second day. I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Rodrigo Dominguez Villegas, who is Director of Research at the UCLA Latino Politics and Public Policy Institute. There he oversees an important team of researchers who are seeking to marshal the strengths of social science research to formulate well-conceived and consequential policy. He has a deep interest in immigrants' rights and is intent on trying to marshal the strengths of public policy to support deported migrants. In particular, he has written scores of policy papers that really reflect that kind of applied social scientific turn that we spoke about earlier yesterday. And this is his first time at the Summer Research Institute, and so we're especially delighted to welcome him here. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much, David, for that introduction. Hi, everybody. It is really a pleasure to be with you all. The past, earlier this week, I wasn't 100% sure if I was going to be able to make it. I got COVID 2.5 weeks ago, and it got really complicated. And little by little, I got out of it, and I am just so thrilled to be able to be here and be able to talk a little bit about our research institute, the kinds of things that we do. And I think something important is to think about the intersections of policy research and communications. And so basically the outline of the presentation will be, I want to give you a little bit of background of what our institute does, how we do it. And then I'm going to go into a little bit of a talk about the importance of data disaggregation for policymaking and for, creating narratives about population groups that have been minoritized and underserved historically. And hopefully I'll give you 3 specific analytical communications tools that you'll take with you and continue thinking about. At the end, I would love to open it up for questions and discussions, and I'm especially interested in hoping to hear from all of you. I know that all of you, you're geographically dispersed within the US and outside of the US, and to have a little bit of a discussion as to how you would use the 3 tools that I'm going to present today about. So with that, a few kind of like housekeeping things. First, please, if there's any questions while I am talking, do not hesitate to ask them either in the chat or to raise your hand. And I'll ask Rose. Rose, if you see someone asking a question in the chat as I'm talking and I'm not answering it, if you can please voice it out so I can look at the chat. Or if someone has the right hand raised in the Zoom feature of hand raising, just make me aware through a verbal cue. Thank you so much. Yeah, so please don't hesitate to interrupt and raise your hand if you have any questions as I go through things. So let's start here. What is the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute now? It is a research center within UCLA that started around 5 years ago. And we are a research center that is trying to do things a little bit different from your traditional research center at a Research One university. What is it that we do differently? So similar to other research centers, we leverage the expertise and the rigorosity of the research that happens at a big university like UCLA. So we do that, the same way as other research centers. But we have other 3 pillars in our mission statement that are advocacy, mobilization, and leadership development. Right. So we truly believe that research by itself is not as impactful as we would like it to be. And our mission is really to expand genuine opportunity for all Americans, especially the Latino communities across the US, right? That's the population that we focus on, but not only that. And so what makes LBPI a little bit different and what has led to a very fast growth of our research center and quickly situating LBPI from originally being a research center about policies for Latinos in Los Angeles to very quickly then moving to understanding Latino policies for Latinos in California. And now it is a national research center that is very well known all across the country. What has made us special? The special part of it has been the advocacy, mobilization, and leadership development, but especially our communications branch, where we don't just produce research for academics to cite each other, right? But instead, we utilize the research that academics are already producing and really great publications in peer-reviewed journals, but we translate them into a way that is easy to create actionable policies, and that's easy to understand for people who are not academics. So that's key to us. And so we have a mobilization team and a communications team that's really powerful in that every time that we publish a report has an outreach plan that I'll talk a little bit about later. And that makes sure that every piece of research that we put out is frequently being shared with, presented in front of, utilized by a series of partners that are outside of academia. And that will make sure that that research and the findings of it are actually reaching the decision makers who are going to be able to implement this. So that's a little bit about our research center. And thanks for the invitation to present here, because I think one of the things that hopefully I will bring into the table is like that different approach to communication and communicating research for policy, policymaking. So today, there's a few things. I want to make sure these are the takeaways that I want you to take with you. Right. So the talk, I guess the title of the talk is Going Beyond Data Disaggregation for Equitable Policy Ideation. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll take with you these key points. First is that data disaggregation, and I'll go into what data disaggregation is necessary but not sufficient to understand structural barriers to opportunity, especially for minoritized groups, and then to design equitable policies. So data disaggregation is necessary, but not sufficient. And then I'll talk about what are actionable tools or additional things that are both analytical and communications tools that need to happen in addition to data disaggregation for us to have policies that are truly transformative and that are more impactful and that reach the most disadvantaged populations that we want to serve. The first one is thinking about structure versus individuals. And my advice will be hopefully to that for analysis, it'll be really important to focus on structures. If we really want to make lasting change and not individuals. And I'll go into detail about this. The second is this idea of giving voice and power, right? Centering and empowering impacted and minoritized communities from, in everything that you do. And again, I'll get into details about it. in a second. And the third one is thinking through this dichotomy of asset versus deficit framing. And my suggestion is that asset framing communication, is really key. And because it reduces stigma about our communities facing injustice. Again, I'm presenting these at the forefront because hopefully, as I talk about these things, we'll bring it back full circle to these, I guess, 4 points. First, that data disaggregation is necessary but insufficient. And then these actionable tools, right? Thinking about structures, utilizing voice and power, and making sure that disadvantaged communities have that voice and that power in everything that we do. And then utilizing an asset framing communication approach as opposed to a deficit framing communication approach. So let's start with step number 1. What is data disaggregation? In very simple terms, data disaggregation is just breaking down information into smaller subpopulations, right? So for example, breaking down any data point that you can and understanding that data point and how that is different for different, people with different racial backgrounds, sex, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientations, disability. Example, what's the median income for someone who is, for people who are of different races, different sexes, different ethnicities, genders, sexual orientations, disability, income, nativity. And the key here is understanding the key variables that have been systemically used for oppression and exclusion of groups, right? So again, our center is all about equitable policymaking. And so we think in the framework of systems systems that are not coincidental, but that have been set up historically to disadvantage certain groups of populations. And how are we going to disentangle and dismantle all of those systems? So that's what data disaggregation is in a very basic way, right? 2 important things about and then why is data disaggregation important for policy making? And first is because in the diagnosis, right? So in understanding what is it that people need, what is it that communities need, the more you disaggregate data, the better you'll get to understand how different communities and different people who have different intersectional identities of these, these characteristics are experiencing a specific outcome. But also in the policy ideation, and we'll talk about a little bit about writing policy later, it gets us away from a one-size-fits-all type of approach and into thinking more specifically about the unique cases, the unique needs and approaches, and again, the unique systems that are impacting groups differently. All right. Now, 2 things that are really important when we're thinking about data disaggregation is that it's important to take an intersectional approach to all data analysis. And so disaggregating the data is not enough, but doing it in a way that you're able to then understand how these different identities intersect, and then how those identities, which are proxies for systems, right? They're proxies for systems that are leading to specific outcomes. How is it that those intersections create overlapping structures that disadvantage certain groups? And also understanding that historically, racist practices have led to systems that do not disaggregate data for BIPOC communities in the United States, especially. Right? And so this idea of data disaggregation, especially for BIPOC communities, is not relatively new, but it is still something that we're fighting against and we have to be advocating all the time. And I'll give you some examples, very specific examples in a second. But the fact that data is not thought of and collected systematically in a way that would allow us to disaggregate and yeah, desegregate it for specific racial ethnic groups, and then do like a deep dive for BIPOC communities is a really important thing, and has very visible and invisible consequences for BIPOC communities. All right, so I'm going to give you an example about how historically researchers, I don't want to name all the stakeholders, but basically historically, data disaggregation has not, for communities of color, and when talking about policy and things that matter for communities of color, has not been a common practice. In academia, in policymaking, in all the different, in industry, in the media, in philanthropy. And so I want to work with you all through an example. And so first, if you can type in the chat, don't press enter yet, but type into your chat box. Don't press enter. The answer to this quick poll, this question: who do you think the majority of Latino voters cast a ballot for in the 2020 election? Did the majority of Latino voters, vote for Donald Trump, or did they vote for Joe Biden? So type in your answer, and when I say go, then you'll all press enter at the same time, just for me to have an idea. All right. So type your answer, either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. Who do you think the majority of Latino voters cast a ballot? Go. All right. So this is more or less like looking at the answers. This is more or less what I was expecting to see, right? A combination of some of you thinking that the majority of Latino voters cast a ballot for Donald Trump, some of you thinking the majority of Latino voters cast a ballot for Joe Biden. The reality is that nationally, overwhelmingly, by a 3-to-1 margin, Latino voters voted for Joe Biden. And it doesn't matter who they voted for, but you'll see the point that I'm going to make. My intuition is that many of you type Trump because the narrative, at least the first 3 or 4 months right after the 2020 election in the media, was this. Right? What the media was talking over and over was about this big surprise. Political analysts and like the typical kind of like CNN, Politico would go on TV or would write for the Washington Post, the New York Times, and would be completely puzzled about the fact that despite 3/4 of Latino voters voting for Biden, there was still between 25 to 30% of Latino voters who voted for Trump, even though Trump had been in office for 4 years, vilifying and codifying policy that was very explicitly anti-Latino. Everyone seemed puzzled. And I have to say something very clear. Not everyone seemed puzzled, but the traditional majority white political pundits were the ones who were puzzled and who drove this narrative in the election, after the election, talking about things like this. Why did Trump gain support among minorities? The myth of the monolithic Latino voting bloc is cracking. The reality is that if people have been paying attention to what the lead Latino researchers, political scientists in the United States have been doing research about, people would have understood that historically, between 20 to 30% of Latino voters were already Republican and have been voting for Republican presidential candidates for the past 30, 40 years. And that voting differentiation, was a not a product of, was reflected in characteristics or elements that impact voting behavior for all groups, regardless of who they are, right? What race they are. Things like education and religion and, ideology and where you came from and age, all of those variables really impacted voting behavior for Latino voters. But no political analyst in either party or in the media was breaking down Latino voters to understand how age, ideology, religion, geography within the United States was impacting the way in which Latino voters voted. Everyone had this monolithic idea that Latinos in the United States are this one group that is just monolithic, and they thought that politically they would all behave as a voting bloc. And despite 2/3 of them, yes, voting for the Democrats for whatever reasons, it was the lack of nuance and data disaggregation that was driving this false narrative that has led to very smart people, like many of you saying, to have the wrong idea that the majority voted for X or Y candidate, right? I am using this example to show how recent it is that the mainstream or the people who have the most power into creating narratives were completely blindfolded by the racist practice of not disaggregating data for minority populations in the United States, right? It's just one of the examples. This one might not have, it has incredible consequences for the political future of the United States. But just as this, there's like so many other examples where non-white populations are not given or where we're not investing in data disaggregation and understanding the nuances for communities of color, right? It's just an example about kind of like historic and how recent this is. And it's still happening in all kinds of fields, from medicine to education to anything that you can imagine. All right. So one of the things that our center is doing is that we're trying to advocate for data disaggregation. We've been doing it for the past 5 years. And a specific project that we are launching this fall is called a Latino Data Hub. And the idea for the Latino Data Hub is that we're going to provide, without the need for anybody to be a data scientist, data on over 80 different indicators across 10 different issue areas at different geographic levels. But most importantly, for each of the indicators, you'll be able to see the same indicator broken down by, a series of characteristics that are really important, that are, what I call axes of stratification, that really limit access to resources for Latino communities. And, if you're interested in signing up for updates as to when we release this database and this data tool, you can go to latinodatahub.org and then you can sign up there. It's not live yet, but you can at least sign up for when it's going to be live. And the idea is that this is step one for us to start advocating for data disaggregation, to better understand the nuances of Latino communities across the United States, so that we can understand the needs of Latino communities much better, and then create policies that are truly reflecting of those nuances. We have coalitions with groups that are doing similar projects. AAPI data, for instance, for Asian American Pacific Islanders. There's a collective of Native American researchers doing the same. The Black Wealth data group, some researchers at NYU doing disaggregated health data by race. But our tool is going to be focused, of course, on the Latino population. Right. And so we're trying to, as we've been advocating for this data disaggregation for decades, we are hoping that this Latino Data Hub is one thing that is very actionable, that democratizes the access to, well, first of all, that makes it visible that Latino communities are very diverse and very nuanced, first of all. And second, that allows anyone, any user, to be able to, by just point and clicking, quickly understand what are those nuances and differences among different groups of Latinos. But I don't know if you remember the main takeaway, right? So that is something that we're building together with a really big coalition of folks. UCLA is leading the task for this. But providing the disaggregated data, as we have been building this data tool and talking to folks in a lot of different places, data disaggregation is necessary, but it is not sufficient to understand the structural barriers for Latinos or for other communities of color. What has our coalition of stakeholders, what have we been talking about a lot? About three important things that we need to pay attention to, in addition to data disaggregation, when we are designing policy. The first one is that for analysis and for narratives, it's really important to focus on structures and not individuals. Here's what I mean with this. Researchers, social scientists that are experts on the way in which kind of like structures have worked to produce racial disparities often come to the conclusion that one of those things that happens because very often in the narrative and in the analysis about differences in outcomes, let's say a health outcome or an education outcome, the explanations and the solutions often get individualized, putting the blame for that negative outcome and the burden of improvement for a negative outcome on individuals rather than on the racist structures that are holding people down. And so as we advocate for data disaggregation, we're almost advocating for understanding the case-by-case, situation of folks. And sometimes when we disaggregate data so much, many times go to that individual explanation and make the leap between the data and the individual explanation in a very quick manner and forget about the structure. And so it's an important tool to continue to think about, right? That if there are racial disparities, those didn't come out of a coincidence. They are a product of historic and structural disadvantages that have been happening. And it's important to dismantle this idea that it is about an individual behavior that led to that negative outcome. A second tool is to think about who has voice and who has power. And what I suggest here is, and that our coalition of researchers and activists and advocates and policymakers propose is that we need, in every single piece of work that we do, we should be centering and empowering impacted and minoritized communities. And so I'm going to give you an example of moments when our institute took a step back, acknowledging our relative visibility and power relative to other communities that we were working with. And we took a step back to make sure that we were following this principle, which is centering and empowering impact in the minoritized communities. So our institute does research that is community informed. And so many of the research questions that we answer come from us having community partners and then asking those questions and being like, hey, people want to know the answer to this. And so a lot of it was, well, people, the Afro-Latinx community kept on telling us, well, I need to visualize to make visible the uniqueness of Afro-Latinos in the US. There's a lack of understanding about what's going on with Afro-Latinos in the US. And so what our institute did was create a coalition of Afro-Latinx researchers and community organizers who came up with questions and ideas and research protocols, etc., to create this incredible, the first of its kind profile of the Afro-Latinx community in the United States. And we took a step back from the research design to the data analysis, to the presentation, to the writing, to the actual visual design of the report, and to the dissemination of the report, acknowledging that within UCLA, within the social sciences, we have 2 Afro-Latinas, and we didn't have enough Afro-Latino researchers within our institute, right? And so we funded them, they led the research, and they led the dissemination of the report. And what that led to were things like what Nicole Morales says here. Oh, sorry. Over here in this, so people were sharing the report. This was released maybe 3 months ago. And it's made the rounds in the media. It's gone to like a lot of different, to Washington, D.C., to Congress. These groups have done presentations in Washington, D.C., in Sacramento, etc. But we were frequently monitoring social media and how were people reacting to this report. And there were like hundreds of people online saying things like this: finally tangible information that acknowledges my lived experience. Our experiences are different, but are important, right? Which for us was a measure of success. What is the success of this research? To me, these comments are measures of our success. For me, my success is not about how many times this report is being cited in a peer-reviewed journal. Our institute's success is measured in this and in policies that are going to be designed in ways that are going to take the lived experience and the uniqueness of being an Afro-Latino, and what are the systems that are intersecting the anti-Blackness, the language systems, the historic colonialism of, colonial systems that impacted people from Latin America, to lead to certain barriers that are very real for Afro-Latinos in the United States. And so we are achieving that success because the voice and the power is being centered on the community that we're talking about, by the community that we're talking about. It is not me, a non-Afro-Latino of Mexican origin, bringing this up. It is the specific group of people that we're talking about who are designing the research and then communicating it. And the third thing that's important to kind of like think carefully about is this, asset versus deficit framing. My suggestion is that asset framing communication reduces stigma about communities facing injustice. So I want to take a step back and define kind of like the dichotomy asset versus deficit. Many, many, many times when we're talking about disadvantaged communities, communities that have been under-resourced, under-invested. We tend to fall into into starting the narrative and the report and the talking about it in a way that shows problems, right? And then what people make an association about is they make an association between a group, a demographic group, and a socioeconomic social problem, which historically has led to stigmatization of whole, groups of people. Now we're trying to do a shift from falling into that almost exclusive focus on what is it that our communities are missing, or what is it that our communities are unable to do because of systemic barriers, into highlighting the assets of our communities, right? And so that is the difference between an asset and a deficit framing. It is about how much weight you're putting into, as you're talking about a policy issue, are you putting all your weight in your narrative and in your writing to describing especially communities of color as communities that have deficits? Or are you bringing up also the other side, which is about presenting all the assets that these communities have that they could be utilizing to, fulfill economic opportunity, or, full participation in democracy, or whatever your outcome is. And so when doing that shift, which is an important narrative shift, and that we're really trying to advocate for, it's important to not think about it is one or the other, right? So it is not about hiding or diminishing the impact that structural and historic practices have on minoritized communities. It's not about like, oh, we're not going to talk about that. No, yes, we're going to talk about that. But it is about also presenting the other side of the story, right? And contributing to narratives that dispel commonly held and damaging beliefs. And commonly held and damaging beliefs that are being now weaponized by very powerful groups of people who are in policy decision-making places, which is also important to add. Right, and so so I want to stop here in kind of like recapping kind of like the main messages based on the experience that we have as a research institute that is now of national prominence, and the kind of work that we do with community, and then trying to bring together this idea of research for policy action, but also how do you communicate that research, right? And so it's three things. Well, one is data disaggregation is key, but not sufficient. And that as we improve on data disaggregation and understanding based on data collection, et cetera, that there are these other three tools that we can utilize when communicating research and communicating policy. The first one is thinking about structures and not blaming individuals for any issues. The second is centering impacted communities and thinking about and giving them voice and power. And that many times means that if you understand yourself or your institute or your position as a relatively privileged position, that means taking a step back, leaving your ego behind, your fame behind, your resources behind, so that this happens. And third, trying to start shifting when you're communicating from being a purely deficit frame communication strategy to one that also highlights assets about communities that we're talking about. that we're trying to, write policy for. All right. With this, I will stop talking, but I invite you to ask, well, first to ask any questions about what I presented.
Rodrigo, do you want to maybe take down the presentation? Right.
Yes.
Okay. So the floor is now open for questions, comments. Feel free to pose questions in the chat or use the raised hand function. I'm going to start, Rodrigo, because I have some questions. When you frame your work, say in the form of a report, do you have a clear sense of who your audience is? That's number one. Number two, do you propose recommendations that seek to achieve the goals that you've articulated? And I'm asking these questions because I really would love for you to get at, take a step back, sort of put back your hat as a sociologist, and let's even say as a historical sociologist, which brings us closer to the discipline of history, and reflect a bit on the enterprise of applied research, which is not intuitive to many historians, for example. How do you actually leverage the power of social science to applied knowledge in ways that can have an impact? And so this is one of the things that we learned when we began our work at the Luskin Center for History and Policy, that it's really important to have in mind an audience. That's a kind of important reframe of, I'm going to undertake a research project that's going to try and sort of correct a wrong. But it's really important to have an audience in mind. So I wonder if that's something that's important to you, if you make it regular practice to include recommendations, and just more generally, if you could reflect on applied social scientific research. So 3 large orders, but you're the person for the job.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess that's a place where, I have started. It's a very fundamental thing. So yes, in terms of the audience, we're always thinking about who the audience is and who our targets are. So again, let me start with the basis of historical research methods and social scientific methods. Incredibly rigorous, right? And so that is the basis for everything that we do. Is that rigor, right? And so the methodological rigor, it is the baseline of our work. Now we're talking about communication strategies to make the research be impactful. And so yes, the first thing to understand is who your audience is. And for us to define, and I like, that's like a key concept of, almost everything. Hopefully you've heard this before. You need to know your audience for a presentation, for writing anything that you want to write, for any communication. But how do you decide who your audience is? What we do is that we do something called power mapping, where we think, what is the data telling us? What are our participants? And this can be qualitative data, data broadly defined, telling us that are the policies that need to be changed for a systematic thing to be reformed to produce a positive outcome for a population, right? So first we start by understanding that. And then we do a power mapping of who are the decision makers that right now have the most leverage in making this happen. And after we identify them, then we identify their incentives that will make them act on the recommendations that we write, that we do write specific recommendations on that. And who do we have to reach? And so at the end of the day, we end up with an action plan that might have different audiences, and that will require that out of the same research project that took maybe a couple of years to implement and to get to the findings too. So that rigor, we don't put it to the side. And that amount of time that it takes to get very fruitful findings, we don't put it on the side. But instead, we utilize that. We do a power mapping, think about all these incentives, and then think about the different audiences, and then produce different products for those different audiences. What are the different products? A general thing is a report. Thank you, Rose, for instance, putting the Afro-Latinidad report in the chat. That's one. Shorter briefs. On our website, we have a set of 15 facts about Latinos in California, 15 facts about Latinos in Florida. That's another way. And those are geared towards congressional staff that have 10 minutes to understand something, and for them to start moving, or like to highlight an issue about Latinos in a specific state. So we produce full-blown reports, fact sheets, we produce media press releases. Those are targeting the media so that the media then creates buzz about something, some findings that we unearthed that we want the broader public or specific decision makers to understand. We produce presentations. We produce social media content. And all of these mediums are bringing the same message about our findings from our research and the recommendations that we're trying to implement for decision makers to implement, but targeting different audiences that all together are going to pressure the most powerful decision makers to actually act upon things.
Thank you. Others? Vishnu.
Thank you for this and giving this opportunity. Actually, I would like to know, Rodrigo, that nowadays the main challenge is for media also, that is misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah.
But tackling for that misinformation or disinformation, if somebody is doing research, that for research that is time consuming and it takes longer, like to identify the fact. When you were talking about like this segregating the data, that is also time consuming. So in between, something can become like viral in social media or traditional media, and that create like different type of narratives. So it is quite challenging for like combine type of thing what you were talking about, policy intervention or media creating the buzz. So do you think there is any type of like tackling things to combining research and that tackling misinformation or disinformation?
Thank you so much, Vishnu. That is an incredibly thoughtful question and very real. And if I may say, it's one of our biggest challenges right now as researchers and advocates for social change and for racial justice. The pace at which misinformation or just information generally disseminates is very quickly And as you said, for us to have nuanced, carefully thought about findings, it takes time. And so these two things are competing a lot. And we are fighting against it. Now, what are our approaches? Our approaches to not this thing, and this is where I think our institute, I mean, we're struggling with this, and I think and so are, you know, most stakeholders struggling with not keeping up with the pace at which information and unfortunately misinformation gets spread around. However, within academia, that's a particularly big problem. And this is an important thing. If any of you are thinking about staying in academia, it is an important thing to be thinking about, because academic institutions overall are incredibly slow at thinking about this and reacting to things like that, right? The incentives aren't there within the academic structure for us as academics to be reactive enough and quick enough to have an eye out and in as fast enough as we need it to be to react to misinformation. So it's one of the things that we're trying to, as we embark in a very long-term project of also reforming academia and what academic research is about and how we use it for positive change. One of the things that we are trying to show is that there can be a model where academics are maintaining their rigor and maintaining their thoughtfulness, but where if we put enough thought into the communication strategy, that we're able to influence things at a faster pace and a more impactful pace. We are not there yet to like be able to so quickly react to it. And I think that comes with building a setup of coalitions and willpower that is still not there from a set of actors that have become even more harder to work, like even harder to work with lately. But it is a challenge that I think one of the things that we're trying to promote is we want to make sure, we want to get academia to not shy away from this, because it is transforming communities, it is transforming our countries, transforming governments, etc. And many times the reactions from academic administrators is like, oh no, if you're using your research for like actually informing change, you're being an advocate, and then you're no longer being a researcher. We're trying to promote a different model.
Okay, we have a question from Olivia.
Hi, thank you for coming to share with us today. My question, I have been thinking a lot about data disaggregation, and specifically kind of like the data we have available to allow us to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that like a lot of the data that we collect about people's identities is through like these socially imposed categories that sometimes, right, like it makes sense to collect the data because they're socially imposed, and so they have real social consequences for people. But at the same time, like we have to be missing some kind of categories of identity when we are only taking like the outsider imposition of who someone is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you kind of touched on this when you were talking about how the Afro-Latinidad report came about. But I guess I'm kind of curious, like, how do we think about pushing for more nuanced subgroup definitions? And like, what are the limits of that, right? Because especially if we're doing surveys, if you have like 50 questions about someone's identity, you don't even get to the questions that you're trying to explore.
Mhm.
And then I think kind of related, like, are there ways to have feedback loops with communities to kind of understand if the categories that we are representing or exploring, if they feel that they're like actually representing them?
Thank you, Olivia. That's an important question to think about. I think the answer is in your question. Right. So first of all, I agree with you. Anytime that we create categories, we are missing nuance, regardless of what category it is. We do so sometimes as an analytical tool, but recognizing what you said, and the reason why I'm saying the answer is that the answer is in your question, is that your question lets me know that you are understanding that by categorizing, you are missing something. Integrating that into the research process to understand what is it that you're missing as you create these categories is incredibly important. And you mentioned feedback loops, which again, it brings me back to this, what I said. The answer is in your question, right? How are you going to understand what are you missing when you're creating categories for analytical purposes? That setup of a feedback loop with yeah, and my personal approach, and I think a lot of the researchers that we engage with, is usually that the feedback loop has to happen with, again, designed by and led by the communities that we are talking about, or that a specific thing is going to impact the most. And so that those are kind of like the principles. Fighting for that, in practical ways, right? We have to fundraise for these research projects and for all these things. It is a struggle, if I may say, like it is a struggle in, convincing the funders that feedback loop and the time that it takes would actually lead to like much more nuanced understanding of things and to better policy recommendations and to better actionable items and things like that. It's a struggle at every step of the way. It takes a lot of thoughtfulness. It takes a lot of community building. It takes a lot of like introspection. It's exhausting. It's tiring. It's time consuming. It is necessary though. And so the fact that there are obstacles does not mean that we need to shy away from those obstacles and to say, okay, because these obstacles are, and because the way that it has been done all the time is not this way, then we have to not do it the way that we know that it's a better way of doing it.
Other questions? Stuff down.
Hi, Professor. I was wondering how you go about, I guess, establishing trust in the communities to give you accurate surveys. You did mention like the two Afro-Latino professors that were there at UCLA. They spearheaded the movement for the report. But I was wondering just wouldn't that still be off-putting to the community, the fact that there were only two?
Yeah. So thank you so much, Safdar. That's a really quick key question. And again, I hope Rose and David are not regretting inviting me to this talk. Because it's really important to think about that. And because historically, academia has been an extractive institution that has gone into underserved communities to extract from them and not to do anything with them. And so communities know that. And so we have to go against like centuries of work and continued work of academics extracting from communities. And so the thoughtfulness that you present, Safdar, in how do you build trust with communities is something that we would hope that academia would have ingrained in itself, but it is not. And it is just a fact. And if you talk to the most underserved communities in the United States and around the world, most of them will say, if you ask them, what has academia given you? When they come and ask you questions about, I don't know, how is the AIDS pandemic impacting, I don't know, queer communities in South Africa? They won't be able to tell you that they got an immediate benefit, right? All that they'll be able to say is that, oh, researchers came and asked me questions and they just extracted information from me and they never engaged me again. And so it is super important to change that perspective from the ground up, from the top down, and to be thoughtful about rebuilding that trust. And it is a huge challenge because now we're fighting against, it is about gaining trust from communities that have been exploited for centuries by academia. And so it's really challenging. And so the Afro-Latino report was not a report where we went to do surveys with community. We leveraged the data that was already collected by the Census Bureau, as imperfect as it was. But the coalition that was built, and Nancy Lopez from the University of New Mexico and other Afro-Latino scholars built that coalition, was about, thinking through understanding the weaknesses of the Census Bureau, the historic processes about how that data was collected, and then building the coalition of both researchers, on the ground experts. That's a whole other story about what does academia consider expertise is also a historically problematic concept that we are trying to bring down, and that will hopefully allow to build better trust, right? If I put in on equal grounds a tenured professor and someone who has worked with that community for 40 years as a practitioner providing a service, which to me they're equal, that might allow to start building some trust. When the community sees that academia is not just coming as an elitist institution to tell other folks how they're supposed to be living their lives and what they're supposed to be doing, then you start building their trust, building some trust. But it is a huge battle, and it takes a lot of time. And so it's another thing, like we have to convince funders and our administrators within UCLA and sometimes some researchers that this community trust is important. And not just that, but, and I hope you all keep us accountable to this, right? And so the accountability is important, because then I'm talking about it right now, but as I'm talking, I might be engaging in the behavior or in the things that I'm critiquing. And so it's also important to have accountability mechanisms built in to make sure that we are actually walking the walk and not just talking the talk. But yeah, it's super hard. It's hard for me to say, how do you build trust, except for a lot of, stepping back, first of all, centering folks. It takes time, and it takes just a lot of thought.
So much more to say about that point, and sort of the Manichaean or Janus-faced nature of academia, of universities, of institutions that are, on one hand, the embodiments of deep structures of oppression, and also contain within them the capacity either for some measure of remedy, reform, and in some case liberation, sort of. And here we find ourselves. Your background is the very institution that is both the source of new knowledge and old and oppressive patterns. Mm-hmm. But we could talk about this for a very long time, and should on some occasion, but we have two questions, so I want to make sure to get to them. Valentina and then Alexander. So Valentina, please.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Dominguez. I am also a sociologist by training. Well, I'm being trained as a sociologist. I'm in my third year of my PhD program here at UCLA. And I am really interested in how you discussed including the community, because I'm sure there's a lot of push within sociology of this participatory action committees and like, you know, bringing in the community to our research. And I'm an immigration scholar, and I'm interested in researching how like NGOs, like more of like the power side, not necessarily on the immigrant side, but more of like the people that run the NGOs and how they influence like immigrant outcomes or and policy. But the primary method I use is ethnography, and I struggle with what you were just talking about, this sort of like how to not take more than I'm giving back, and how to give back, how to make people part of my work when they're not, that's not what they, you know, they let me come in because I volunteer and I mostly observe, but they're not really interested in, you know, co-authoring with me, or like half the time they're like, what are you doing? Like, why are you, and so, so I struggle kind of with that. Like, how do we like still do research that's really worth doing when the people we're studying or the organizations we're studying aren't really interested in that academic side, and sort of like how to still contribute without kind of like, because I think centering these voices is important, but sometimes the motivation behind an NGO is a lot different than the motivation behind an academic, and then also the motivation behind a client. And so I always like struggle with like, okay, the client is here, they have a certain expectation. If I interview them, they might assume that I can help them. In the same way with the NGO, like they might assume that I have like more power because I'm like backed by an institution like UCLA. So I always struggle with like that part of research, especially within ethnography, which requires like so much time to like build that trust. And so I spend all this time and like, you know, develop relationships. And so it doesn't ever feel like I'm extracting, but I also, you know, would love to incorporate other research methods that like I can for applied research. But yeah, I kind of like struggle with these like different motivations and sort of like how to justify like research that isn't necessarily in an interest to the people that we're researching. But
Thank you so much, Valentina. You like let me thinking a lot. I think this group, for instance, and you all are participants in this summer research institute precisely because you're very thoughtful about, you care about this, right? I think, I don't know, a few things that come to my head, and that my head is a little foggy right now. Well, the first is like listening. Well, I have like a few things that are competing with each other. One is this idea of always, you know, understanding your source of privilege and power and giving that up. If you have privilege and power, you've got to give it up as much as possible. Like, why should I have? And it sounds simple. Sometimes when I talk to my husband, my favorite movie is Forrest Gump. I tell him, like, think about the Forrest Gump approach, right? Which is the simplistic, the most immediate answer about how to fulfill a task. And so even though it's very complicated, if you're recognizing that you have some power backed by an institution like UCLA, which is backed by the bigger institution of academia, which is embedded within other bigger structures, the first thing is to try to, so you have understood that. And the most immediate thing that I would try to do is, how do I give some of that away, right? And not take it with me. And so you were saying, like, your interest as a researcher might not be the same as the interest of the head of the organization, and maybe it's an organization that's providing services to folks. Maybe it's not the same as the needs or the interest of those who are being served. And so what does that what does giving up your power and understanding in this situation would mean to me is to elevate the interest of the NGO and those who are being served, and then and better understand it. And how does that work in reality is by, you know, investing most of the time for them to be, well, the resources, financial resources, time resources, connections. So many times, you know, with my students, I talk about the R-cube model, right? Resources, recognition, and relationships. And these three things are really important for things to happen in the world. And when you make sure that you are not the one who is gathering all the financial resources, all the recognition, and all the relationships that come out of the research that you're doing, then I think you're doing, you know, you're going in a more positive direction. So giving some of those R's away, some of the resources away, some of the some of all relationships and recognition.
So we'll get to Alexander's question. One minute. I just want to acknowledge what an extraordinary performance this is by you, Rodrigo. One would not know that you have been felled by COVID. You've been sort of a complete exemplar of clarity in your presentation and response, and we're really deeply grateful that you are able to be with us. So thank you very, very much. And Alexander.
So I'm just definitely not gonna take too long. My first question is, what's the name of the model? And then also, I don't want to be redundant, so if you answered this already, definitely don't feel that you have to dwell on this. But what are like the constraints to categorization? Like, can we have overlapping or expanded categories? Is it possible to have participants input their own categories when we're surveying them? And then my last one is just, have you surveyed any Latinos who identify as Indigenous or people from Latin American countries that have an Indigenous identity rather than a Latino one, like specifically migrants or refugees? And that one's really specific, so if you can't answer that one, no problem.
Thank you, Alexander. Those are really important questions. I'm trying to, again, organize them in my head. One was like very practical as to, you know, how to create categories for surveys. I'm imagining that many of you are in like survey methods, types of classes, etc. There's a whole science to it. So I am putting together something with that I will share later, either at the end of the day or you'll all get from Rose. I'm trying to put together kind of like a list of resources of readings that I hope, I have my suspicions, are resources that you would not be assigned in most of your coursework. Some of which engage with these questions that you're asking, Alexander. You know, how to create categories in survey design, etc. I mean, there are some principles, and again, like when I'm teaching a very introductory class on survey design, you know, we talk about categories being collectively exhaustive. What is the term? I'm forgetting the term, but anyway, the categories need to be, you know, all of them need to be, you need to capture everybody in the population into one of the categories that you create. And the category should be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. That's like the kind of like basic rule of creating categories for survey design and for asking questions. But then how do you come up with those? Again, the answer is in your question. You said, do you first go to the community and talk to people and then ask them how are they categorizing? Yes. Do you go back 6 months later and ask them again, how are they fitting themselves in the categories? Yes. Does the Census Bureau do that? They're trying to, and we are in a task force to make sure that the Census Bureau does that, because our own perceptions of ourselves into different categories and perceptions of others placing us into categories are evolving all the time, right? And so the way in which you perceive yourself they change over time and over place, like depends on where you are. And by place, I don't necessarily mean geographically, but also socially, like your social location, whether you're within your family, or in your community, or in your school, etc. Might change that self-categorization, and also might change how other categorize. So anyway, some of the basic rules is like it's about like very frequently understanding how these categories are changing. And then, but like if we go to like the basics of survey design, I think this collectively exhaustive and mutually exclusive, in most cases, they make a lot of sense to follow that as a basic rule. But sometimes you can challenge them and think about reasons why.
That may be a sign that we should release you to bed. This has been really just a super and immensely stimulating session. Please join me in thanking Dr. Rodrigo Dominguez Villegas for really illuminating us in so many important ways. It's really been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. I'm gonna put my email in the chat. And then you'll receive some resources from Rose. Will email them to you. Hopefully by the end of today. I'll do my best to finalize it by the end of today, but if not, soon.
Okay. Take good care.
Right.
See you. Okay. To the rest of us, just a reminder, we're going to break now for lunch until 1 o'clock. At that point, we will hear our final speaker, Dr. Bharat Venkat, who's going to be talking about his important work on what the intersection of climate change and racial inequality. And then we're going to move from that into our final breakout group, which will provide you the opportunity to reflect on all that you heard over the last day and a half, and to share your thoughts about possible research topics that you might be interested in undertaking moving forward. So I really do encourage you all to make time for that last breakout group. We're going to cut down the time that we allocated it to 45 minutes, and therefore we expect to finish earlier today than we had anticipated, somewhere between 4:15 and 4:30 Pacific time. So in the meantime, have a good break, and we'll see you back here at 1.